Welcome to Block Time, a podcast by Riot, where we take a deep dive into Bitcoin, Bitcoin mining, the world of energy, and any other kind of rabbit holes that we end up on. Today we've got Sam Lyman. He's Director of Public Policy here at Riot. Recently joined the company. Excited to have you on, Sam. What brought you into town today? I know you're based out of DC.
Yeah, so based out of DC, but Riot's hosting their holiday party tonight, and I've heard really good things about it. So I jumped at the opportunity to come, and conveniently it seemed like a good time to do a podcast as well. And since I joined the company, I've watched a couple Block Time episodes, and it's really good content. So I appreciated the invite to come on, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So I'd like to start with your background, because I think that it's a unique background, and I was really excited when we hired you because of that. So walk us through kind of what your experiences have been, and then how you ended up kind of going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and Bitcoin mining and joining Riot.
For sure. So I started my career on Capitol Hill. I was working for Senator Orrin Hatch. Senator Hatch was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee at the time. Eventually, I became his speechwriter. My route into speechwriting was an unorthodox one, we might say. I knew that Senator Hatch was a really funny guy. He was a joke teller, and I walked into his office one day and I found a list of jokes that he had made himself, and some jokes that he'd worked with someone on the outside to write as well. And I just asked the chief of staff at the time, I said, could I try helping Senator Hatch write some jokes? And he said, yeah, go for it. And so that's actually how I got my foot in the door with speechwriting. Was I would write Senator Hatch's jokes. He would use them in speeches on the Senate floor, just different town halls back in Utah. So he was great, and he was so funny off the cuff as well, but he liked the pre-written joke as well. And so he said, Sam, keep doing this, keep writing jokes. And eventually he gave me more opportunities to branch beyond jokes. I started to write press releases, I started to write op-eds, and eventually speeches, till one day he said, you're my speechwriter now. So I was a speechwriter for Senator Hatch for about 5 years. And then after that, I went to be a speechwriter at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in D.C. I worked there for a while. Then I jumped over to the think tank world. And that's when I really started to dip my toes into Bitcoin, especially as it relates to legislative policy. Of course, it was the period of 2020, 2021, where you had runaway spending by Congress, reckless money printing by the Fed, where you could almost see inflation happening in real time. And that's when I took the orange pill, so to speak, and went down the rabbit hole and have since not emerged from it. So that's when I started working on Bitcoin policy, helped write a few op-eds and different pieces of content when I was at this think tank. And then after that, I took some time off to do a graduate program at Princeton, where I really dived deeper into Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency space more broadly. Of course, there's a big difference between those two things, as we know, but it's a really hot area legislatively right now. And so I started writing for Forbes at that time about digital assets. One thing kind of led to another, and I got the invite to interview with Riot over the summer, and the rest is history. It's been great working here for the past couple months.
Yeah, awesome. What were the conversations like at Princeton when you'd bring up that, hey, I'm doing a deep dive into this crypto world?
Definitely, there's still that stigma attached to it. We have to keep in mind that this was in the wake of FTX and that whole debacle. And so actually, when I was writing my first research paper, it was more focused on stable coins than Bitcoin. But my professor at the time said, oh, Bitcoin isn't, he had all those negative connotations attached to it, But when he read my paper, he realized, oh, there's real use cases for not only Bitcoin, but for some other digital assets as well. And he started to recognize, okay, there's something here. And he actually encouraged me to publish that paper. It actually ended up getting published in National Interest, which is a foreign policy magazine. But I think it was kind of an eye-opening moment for both of us, both myself and my professor, to realize, Bitcoin is not going away. It's here to stay. It's Lindy, as they say in the financial world. And it's going to play an important role on the global stage going forward. And I think it was a recognition with other people in my program as well that, oh, Sam, I kind of became branded as the Bitcoin guy. But they came to realize, oh, there's something to this. This guy wouldn't be writing and researching this if this were just a flash in the pan. There's a there. And so it all kind of developed from there. So it was met with skepticism, I would say. But as people read my research, started to dive deeper themselves, they recognized that there's some real substance to this area.
Yeah, I think that at the surface level, it's like, hey, this is a get rich quick Ponzi. And then once you start looking at what's behind it, you're like, oh, wait a minute. It is far deeper than just an investment, a ticker symbol, right?
Right. Yeah, I think for so many people, when they go down the rabbit hole that is Bitcoin, they get a crash course in so much more than just money. It's economics, it's politics, it's sociology, it's psychology. I mean, Bitcoin, as the hardest money in the world, it makes you think more broadly about the world around you. And it makes you think more seriously about the fiat world that we come up in. There's a famous story about there's two fishes swimming in the ocean, and another older fish swims by him and said, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim away and they say, "What the heck is water?" Because they don't realize
Yeah.
that water is what they've been swimming in their whole lives. I think that way about fiat currency as well. People don't really recognize just how risky the fiat system is, and it's not until you get introduced to Bitcoin that you realize that there is potentially an alternative to this crazy, some might call it a Ponzi scheme, that is the US dollar
Right.
system. I won't go so far as to call it that, but it is, in my view, a reckless way to go about money. It seems like a house of cards that without the proper backing could fall apart. And so Bitcoin offers an alternative to that.
Yeah, I'd say what I would call a Ponzi scheme is the layering on top of the dollar of all these liabilities, of promising these everyone, hey, you're going to get money in the future, whether it's in the form of Social Security or treasuries or the banking system, and then when the future arrives, oh well, we got to print money and bail everyone out, and essentially uh, solve the Ponzi scheme problem, right? By printing money and then, the resulting inflation and all that. Which brings me to my question of on Twitter, where the narratives get formed and beaten. Um, there's one view that Bitcoin is apolitical, it's neutral, it's bipartisan or nonpartisan, and then there's another view that Bitcoin is highly political, is libertarian or is right wing or is revolutionary and progressive, right? Like there's like kind of horseshoe theory there. Um, and yeah, I guess how do you see that? Do you think it's both at the same time?
I think it is both at the same time. I also think Bitcoin, in a way, transcends traditional political boundaries. I think a lot of people want to sort it in either the right or the left, the blue camp or the red camp. But I think Bitcoin actually exposes a new fault line in American politics. And that fault line is pro centralization versus pro decentralization. And so there's a really, I think that fault line will become more and more, um, it will become more apparent as politics continues over the next 10 years. And that's why you have some interesting bipartisanship when it comes to Bitcoin still. You have people like Representative Tories, who represents a district in New York, for example. He's a Democrat, right? But he's very pro Bitcoin, among the most pro Bitcoin members of Congress, right? And then you also have Republicans who support it almost as it's a little more natural for them because I think Bitcoin inherently, like you said, is libertarian. But you also see another political divide with Bitcoin beyond just decentralized and centralized parties. It's generational in a lot of ways. What I've noticed in talking to different members on Capitol Hill and their staffs is that older members of Congress oftentimes just don't understand Bitcoin. Again, they came up in that fiat water that we were talking about earlier. Whereas younger generations, they recognize the need for it. I mean, you have people who are Gen Z and millennials. Let's talk about Gen Z. A lot of them are just coming into the workforce right now, and we're living through a cost of living crisis right now. And that causes them to step back and think, why are things so expensive? And why is a hamburger today, 30% more expensive than it was just 3 years ago? And so I think a lot of younger generations sit back and they realize, okay, this US dollar system that we've come up in, it's not infallible. It's definitely got some weaknesses, and Bitcoin is a potential plan B for that.
Yeah, the generational divide. I mean, we see it in like survey data as well of whether it's just globally, or voters specifically. Just the favorability is way skewed towards younger folks. And as I get into my 30s, I'm already of the mind of like, I'm too old to learn about AI. It's like
Yeah.
I need to. I don't know. I need to be younger so that I don't turn into a 70-year-old person so early in my life. But so I mean, I understand where they're coming from. Of like that they have spent a life of service and of learning about things, and at some point you're like, okay, this is some newfangled stuff that is also surrounded by a media bubble of negativity, of whether it's for criminal activity or harming the environment. That then it's like, okay, well, I don't really want anything to do with it. I don't even really want to have a position on it. Like, and something very early on in my Bitcoin journey that I thought was fascinating was I remember people were debating whether Bitcoin was legal or not, just outright, in I think it was like 2012, 2013. And somebody said, in the United States, by default, things are legal. It's only by enacting a law that you make something illegal. Other countries, and like my home country of France, where you have civil code, quite often anything that's not in the civil code is like the Wild West, in the sense that it is illegal because it's not in a formal structure that it hasn't been legalized or legitimized. And I thought that was fascinating. Now, Bitcoin is legal in France, but here in the U.S., like, we've been able to get away with not really having policymakers be engaged with the topic because just by default it's legal and people can just buy and hold Bitcoin. So that I think has insulated Bitcoin from politics, and now politics is being injected into Bitcoin because it has grown so much. If it wasn't multi-$100 billion market cap, I don't know that there would be a lot of Elizabeth Warren tweets about it.
Mhm.
Although she tweets about sandwiches, so
True.
it's like she tweet about anything.
Everything's free game.
Yeah. And it seems like a constantly shifting focus of hers of like, hey, this week I'm going to talk about sandwiches. Next week, go back to talk about Bitcoin.
Yeah, gotta beware of big sandwich.
Yeah, big sandwich. So you mentioned joke writing. I want to tie this with AI as well.
Yeah.
ChatGPT is awful at writing jokes. I don't know if you've tried.
I haven't tried.
I've tried, and I've tried for my kids. I'm like, write a joke for a 6-year-old, and my son will laugh at a good joke 9 times out of 10. But all these jokes, they fell flat from ChatGPT. And so I think that humor is actually something that might be beyond the reach of AI for a while longer. I don't know how much you've thought about humor as like versus just being a natural and just writing jokes. Like, have you done like comedy improv training and things like that?
I haven't, no.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think about humor a lot. I'm a
Yeah.
huge fan of comedy and jokes, and I think there's an interesting application in the political world with humor and Bitcoin, right? People who are crypto native or Bitcoin native, they're very active on Twitter. They're natural memers.
Yeah.
They know how to meme better than just about any other internet niche community out there, right? And so that's what's been, I think, effective in combating false narratives about Bitcoin. I think we saw this yesterday. So just for people who are tuning in, recently, Senator Warren, and you referenced this earlier, she came out against the big sandwich industry, right? And I remember after she came, what she was talking about was a merger between Subway, I think Jimmy John's, and another sandwich chain. And immediately after this, because she's made so many, let's say, people who aren't friends necessarily in the Bitcoin community, people were memeing this silly tweet that she did, right? And I think when you can expose sort of the absurd ideas of the other side through memes, through humor, that's very persuasive stuff. And I remember yesterday as well, Alex DeVries, he just came out with a new study that has these absurd claims that a single Bitcoin transaction can consume an entire swimming pool full of water. And I remember immediately after this, Pierre, you had this awesome tweet of showing how much water Bitcoin actually consumes. And you said, what is this? A swimming pool for ants, right? A reference to Zoolander. And so I think that's something that as a Bitcoin community, we can leverage to our benefit, is that ability to meme, our ability to use Twitter and be internet native in such a way that establishment figures, they don't really know how to react to that. You can tell when a senator is actually tweeting versus when it's their social media intern, right? And some senators are good at tweeting, and some of them are decently good at memeing, but Senator Warren isn't necessarily one of them. And so I think humor is a weapon that, as people who are pro Bitcoin, we have in our arsenal to kind of expose the absurdity of the other side and to help people realize there is another way. There's another currency out there that exists, and in many ways, it reveals some of the craziness of the fiat system that we live in.
Do you think it's fair to say that there used to be more humor in politics? That like every politician used to open their speech with a joke to kind of hook the audience in and then launch into substance, and that kind of decreased?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think because on one hand, it's become so much more intense, so much more polarized.
Yeah, they're
right?
trying to make people angry. They're not trying to make people laugh.
Yeah, exactly. It's unfortunate. And as a result, there's not much room for humor. At the same time, Trump,
Yeah.
who, let's be honest, both sides are partly responsible for making things more polarized. And Trump is among them for sure. But he's also incredibly funny, right? The man is a traveling comedian. And I think that's what people don't recognize was a huge part of his appeal. So I could see it going both ways. I think some of the humor that used to be natural in politics was a little more canned, if that makes sense. Yeah. And a lot of the humor you see now is a little more authentic when it comes out on social media, when it's actually the senator or member of Congress tweeting out under their own name. It's them behind the keyboard and not, one of their staffers. I think it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah. I think one senator that comes to mind that makes an effort to be funny on social media is Ted Cruz. You'll see him engage with his opponents, right? His ideological opposites, but with a sense of humor. And I think I think that's healthy in in such a polarized environment. But I don't think that everyone sees it that way. Now, what's fascinating is you mentioned Bitcoiners know how to meme. Bitcoin's opponents, I would say, don't know how to meme.
Yeah.
As much as they try.
I mean, I gotta say, I absolutely love that you brought that up, Sam, because that is the God's honest truth, is that Bitcoiners are the absolute meme lords on Twitter. And I like to look sometimes at Pierre's mentions and stuff, because they'll always meme him in a hard hat. Something about, the CO2 testing that we did, that video got memed all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think it just, you also mentioned that Trump was a funny guy. I think the difference there is I don't know if Trump knew that he was funny or if he was just trying to be serious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think his humor was for the most part intentional. When I think about now when he writes many such cases, I have to think that's intentional humor.
I hope so.
Yeah. I won't talk about Barney Frank's nipples, but I thought that was a pretty funny moment. Anyway, bringing it back to Bitcoin. I think that if humor comes more easily when you kind of have some level of confidence in what you're saying, and that the facts are on your side, and so you can just kind of have fun with it, rather than kind of like when I read, I don't want to pick her on her too much, but when I read Elizabeth Warren's tweets, it's like she's like issuing an edict of like, we no longer like sandwiches. We're now, it's like, it's not funny at all.
Right.
And in fact, it's very aloof in a sense of like, okay, I understand you probably have a good technical point on antitrust. And I think if you looked at a map and the concentration of sandwich shops, there might be a thing here of like, we don't want to have too many chains that are, crowding out mom and pop shops. And there might be like a substantive policy point. But it doesn't come through. And instead it just comes through as like, all right, well, a staffer wrote this and you said, hey, I just had a lobbyist in here from probably not a trade association, but a think tank, a progressive think tank that is concerned about Big Sandwich. We need to come out with a statement in favor of, the FTC cracking down on Big Sandwich. But the other thing too is that I think that it's very hard as a skill to engage on social media in a way that you're not constantly getting ratioed or dunked on. Like, I'd say like the person who gets it the worst is Gary Gensler.
Yeah, he asked for it.
He'll tweet the most innocuous thing.
Yeah.
And then there's a massive pile-on. There's a pile-on of people who just don't like his policy positions. And it's not even just crypto. Like on like market structure, you know, like GameStop and all this stuff that like there's almost a grassroots populist backlash against Gary's Twitter account. And he just consistently gets ratioed. But anyway, and then he has the SEC staff make videos that are meant to be humorous.
Yeah.
And often they just come off as tone deaf of like, you're making fun of us. You're not really like, maybe the best form of humor has some self-deprecation in it. But yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. I think Gary Gensler, obviously I disagree with just about all of his policies, right? But I think he's a media maven. I mean, the man knows how to work both social media and traditional media as well. The fact that he tied his crackdown on the NFTs and other altcoins to Kim Kardashian supporting an altcoin from a couple years ago. I mean, that was very deliberate. He knew that would get headlines. When I was at grad school, we took a course on op-ed writing, for example, and we had a professional writer come in and say, if you ever want to get an op-ed placed in a paper, just find a way to tie it to the Kardashians somehow. Use your hook. Kim Kardashian did this, and these are the implications for, you know, fiscal policy going forward. So just take an outrageous hook and tie it to a Kardashian. That's exactly what Gary Gensler was doing in that instant. And I think too, even with his, I can't remember exactly what's called, like 5 minutes with Gary. He has these quick 5-minute clips where he, I think, shows some self-awareness, and he knows well that the Bitcoin community, more so the crypto community, is not a fan of his. I, in a way, I almost respect how he's willing to play into that a little bit, even though I vehemently disagree with his policies. He's a pretty good memer as far as memers go, I think.
What he lacks, I think, is people who agree with him.
Yeah.
And he would avoid the ratios if he had a faction of people who agreed with his policy positions, because it's interesting. You know, lots of people have lost money on like FTX and on crypto and et cetera. And so you would kind of expect that maybe they would flock to him as like, hey, this guy was right about all of this. And now in kind of a reactionary way, because I lost money on crypto, I'm anti-crypto. Surprisingly little of that.
Sam, I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit. You know, you had mentioned that you got your start on Capitol Hill. Around what year was that?
It was interned there in 2013.
Okay, so it's been a little while then.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask what the climate was, you know, with politicians surrounding Bitcoin and crypto in general versus how you think it is now. I don't know how close you have your ear to that door, but, you know, what was the overall sentiment back then, and what is it like now, and how is it moving?
For sure. So when I started in 2013, Bitcoin was sort of an oddity. It really hadn't broken into mainstream discussions in Washington, D.C. I started on Capitol Hill in 2013 as an intern, was hired full-time the next year. I remember in 2017, one of the staffers, he wasn't over anything finance related. He was actually over lands and energy. So it's Bitcoin tangential, I think, Bitcoin adjacent. But he came down in a cold sweat because he was holding his Bitcoin. This was around the time it was, I think it had hit 17,000, was making its way up to 20,000. And he was just debating. He's like, I don't know if I should sell or not. And it was this big moment for me. Obviously, he wasn't working on Bitcoin legislation at the time, but it was one of my first memories of meeting an in real life Bitcoiner. So at that time, though, Bitcoin was still, people were still dismissing it as just Tulip Mania 2.0 or whatever it might be. It wasn't until I went into the think tank world, so we're talking 2020, 2021, that it started to become a very serious point in policy discussions, I think in large part because it had such a massive bull run and people saw that there was huge global adoption for Bitcoin. So it was around that time that Bitcoin really started to garner a lot of respect in DC policy circles. And again, this was before the FTX blow up. So there was a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who were interested in this new asset class and what it might mean for their constituents, what it might mean for their fundraising. I think it was at that point, so 2021, that it really came into the mainstream.
And it like the Kardashians, it became a brand.
Absolutely.
And a bit of a lightning rod as well. In the, hey, if you want to get an op-ed place, talk about Bitcoin and crypto.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. It's interesting. So on the side, I write for Forbes, and we are all about SEO maximization, right? Search engine optimization. And so with SEO, by simply putting Bitcoin in the headline of an article, it gets clicks because people are always interested. People, and that's what's interesting about going on the Hill and talking to legislators about this. So few people really understand what Bitcoin is. That's why so much of my job and probably our job collectively as a company is just Bitcoin education, helping people understand the 21 million coin cap, helping people understand the idea of hard money, the point of proof of work. It's all education at the end of the day. And so that's something that we really focus on the public policy side of things.
Yeah, I mean, at the extreme, there were people tweeting just the word Bitcoin and then getting like 10,000 retweets because it was like Elon Musk tweeting Bitcoin. And that was like exciting. But then I think it causes a certain amount of just surface level knowledge about it. And then from there, it's kind of like a funnel of like, well, you need to go down the rabbit hole. You need to learn about Bitcoin. And what I've heard is that there's just so many different people saying different things that are often contradictory that once you start going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you've got to like, there's constant forks, right? Metaphorically, not actual, like Bcash or whatever. But I mean like forks in the road of, do I listen to this person or do I listen to this person? Which set of facts am I going to adopt? And am I going to end up being, anti-Bitcoin, no coiner? Or am I going to end up being Bitcoin maxi, purist? Or am I going to end up like just broadly pro-crypto? And that I found fascinating, which is that it, you mentioned that it kind of creates a new paradigm within politics, a new dimension. And there's like a political world within crypto that is basically completely different than the political world outside of crypto. There's not a left and right within, there's really Bitcoin maxis and crypto people, I think is kind of the big divide within. And then within crypto, obviously you've got the people who are like, oh, Cardano's the best, Ethereum's the best, etc. But how do you, and sometimes I'll say, sometimes I feel like a Bitcoin politician on Twitter of like, I'm asked to take a position on the latest issue, going on the Bitcoin network of like, hey, what do you think about this soft fork proposal and whatnot? But I'd be curious to hear like what your view is on kind of the political side within the industry rather than just in the interaction in DC.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because in a lot of ways, I think it mirrors that emerging political divide in the normie political world. Let's call it the fiat political world, whatever you want to call it, of centralization and decentralization. I think in crypto, as opposed to being a right or a left, there's just a spectrum of how centralized a cryptocurrency is to how decentralized it is. And we know that Bitcoin is the most decentralized cryptocurrency that exists. And so if I were to draw a parallel between the crypto political world and the normal political world, I would almost describe Bitcoiners as the conservatives, the people who believe sort of in the tried and true method of doing things, which is Bitcoin, and are a little more opposed to the wild speculation and experimentation that happens in the altcoin world. And I think as you go further away from Bitcoin, oftentimes you go further and further away from decentralization as well, and you become more decentralized as a cryptocurrency. There are potentially some trade-offs with that. You can, it's easier to change the protocol, for example, but there's also trade-offs with that. For example, according to Gary Gensler's SEC, a lot of those altcoins could be a security, whereas Bitcoin doesn't have to worry about that same threat coming from regulatory agencies because it's been pretty cleared up within DC that Bitcoin is a commodity because in large part it is so decentralized. So that's kind of how I view it within the political world is Bitcoin equals conservatism. And I would almost say Ethereum and the rest of that altcoin world is more liberal, so to speak, if we were to kind of draw a parallel between normie world and crypto world.
Yeah. Well, an interesting phenomenon we saw in the previous bull market with the rise of Solana was that suddenly Ethereum people were adopting some of the same positions of Bitcoin people. And so it's like as you get older, as your network gets older, you start shifting into actually, we know that this is tried and true, and your new upstart thing is too centralized, and they'd call it sequelana. I think it's like it's just it's and so maybe it's just like inevitable that in the next bull market there will be another thing that is trying to replace Solana, and the Solana people will become more conservative, right? It's just like. But Bitcoiners will always be the most conservative because they're always going to be the oldest.
Right. The old fogey in the room.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it's funny you mentioned that because it seems that when Ethereum came on the scene, they felt very defensive because Bitcoiners would attack Ethereum. But I think Ethereum holders, they don't recognize that they are the enemy they swore to destroy by being that way towards the Solana community right now, by saying, oh, it's too centralized, it's too this, it's too that. Exactly to your point. I mean, you kind of become the old man that you never thought you would, just the longer you stay in the cryptocurrency space.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just avarice of like, I'm protecting my bags, and I don't want dilution from kind of attention going to mindshare, going to other networks. But then there is also kind of a genuine substantive software engineering like disagreement on what's the best way to scale blockchain, right? And kind of what are the properties. But do you think that it affects the way the industry interfaces with the traditional political system in that like we're seen as being divided versus a need for unity?
I think in the end, it actually redounds to Bitcoin's benefit because, again, it is Lindy. And so it seems like even mainstream media is starting to pick up on this idea that there's Bitcoin and then there's the rest. There's Bitcoin and then there's cryptocurrency, right? So how that's viewed by the rest of the world, I think people who are not crypto native, they're more open towards altcoins, right? We know, for example, Dogecoin being the perfect example. I think a lot of normies come into the world and they just see price goes up and they'll kind of jump on that train, But I also think it's somewhat of a liability for the industry when you have this huge proliferation of so many different coins. It's hard to take it seriously, right? And that's why I think Bitcoin plays an important role for the reputation of the whole space as being sort of the more reputable token, the cryptocurrency that has been tested over time, that's proven itself to be anti-fragile. I think Bitcoin carries the rest of the cryptocurrency world on its back in a lot of ways, just because it is so established. And I think sometimes other cryptocurrencies ride Bitcoin's coattails. I mean, we know for a fact, if you look at price movements, for example, it's always Bitcoin that goes on a bull run first, and then the altcoins follow, right? So I do think that outside of the crypto world, people might look at the proliferation of Shiba Inu, Kishu Inu, all these crazy different variations of Inu coins. I think they look at that and in a way, it makes people roll their eyes at the industry. I think it's great that people have the freedom to start their own currencies at the end of the day, but I think Bitcoin injects more seriousness into the conversation because, again, it has been around for so long. You have firms like BlackRock and Fidelity talking about rolling out a Bitcoin ETF, for example. Thankfully, Bitcoin's there to, again, pick up a lot of the coattail riders, so to speak.
Yeah. You mentioned people creating their own currencies, and I think that like maybe this is the key political question. Elizabeth Warren will talk about the environment, or Alex DeVries will talk about the water, which. But really, I think that the debate that should be happening that is not happening is the debate over what is the proper role of government in the market for currencies. And on one hand, you have kind of the chartalist view that the government should have a monopoly on currency and that it's kind of a sovereign level institution, just like the Department of Defense, right? Standing army, or, well, I guess we're not supposed to have a standing army, but anyway, it's, it is a core function of government to have a one currency to the end of commerce, right, and of prosperity, because it reduces all the friction involved with having lots of different competing currencies like we had before. There were competing dollars in the United States. Versus kind of probably the more libertarian view of, hey, anybody should be able to create their own currency and let's just let currencies compete, and then the market outcome will be whatever is most efficient. And that debate, I feel like it's a debate that, because it is so subjective, and in our world, subjective preferences are not persuasive in a sense of like, okay, well, of course, Elizabeth Warren's going to argue for having a monopoly. She's a senator, and so she'll be close to the money spigot. In the end, that debate resolves to, hey, let the consumer choose, right, of what currency they want to use. So it kind of resolves in a way that they don't like. And so they take a different debate, which is the environmental impact, the AML, like all of these kind of, I would argue, are side issues compared to the central one of monetary sovereignty. They're like, well, let's talk about, carbon emissions, because we don't want to talk about should there be currency competition or not, because we feel like we're going to lose that debate given kind of the zeitgeist of where society is today.
Yeah.
Do you think that's fair, or like that they don't think about the monetary sovereignty issue all that much?
They probably don't think about it as much as Bitcoiners do, but I think oftentimes when you see those FUD attacks against Bitcoin, be it the environmental angle, this new bizarre water angle, or the AML angle, I think it's people oftentimes protecting their own interests, talking their own bag, so to speak. I mean, Elizabeth Warren is a really interesting example, right? She clearly despises Bitcoin, which is ironic because historically she's also despised the big banks. And what Bitcoin offers is an opportunity for the sovereign individual to be his own bank, for the Joe Schmo from the Midwestern United States to essentially hold his own assets and not be beholden to the middlemen in the banking system, right? You'd think because Elizabeth Warren is so anti-bank that she'd be against that. But this goes back a little bit towards that new political divide that I see forming, where people are either pro-decentralization or pro-centralization. I believe the reason that Elizabeth Warren despises Bitcoin is because she's very pro-centralization. She doesn't like the fact that Bitcoin offers a decentralized alternative to the US dollar. And so that's why she levies all these attacks against it, be it, it's very involved in illicit financing, which is patently false, be it that, Bitcoin is terrible for the environment, again, the new water FUD as well. What she's really doing there is she's attacking something that's bad for her political interests. Her political interests lie in enacting policies that require more centralization and require more people to rally around the US dollar system, which is why she's also very pro CBDC, which is an inconvenient fact for her, which I think she's trying to tamp down on at the moment. But there's been multiple times where she's been on the record registering her support for CBDC at the end of the day. So Elizabeth Warren, she's just talking her bags with the CBDC by attacking Bitcoin. That's kind of how I see it.
I just look at the acronyms. All right, there's an eerie similarity between CBDC and CFPB. So I'll just
True.
I'll leave it there. I'll let the conspiracy theorists figure out. But seriously, I think that it goes back to the centralization. Is that she likes the CFPB because I just saw they're going to decide that credit card late payment fees are going to be a maximum of $8, no longer $40. So like, she wants to be able to fine tune things in order to get a particular policy outcome. And, to her credit, I do think that she has a genuine interest in helping people with their financial situation. And she, as an academic, I think was into the topic of debt and bankruptcy and all this, which ironically, I think Bitcoin helps a lot with, whether it's with fees or with debt. That Bitcoin, is has volatile fees, but for the most part low, and then with Lightning really low, and then incentivizes savings instead of indebtedness. But it's such a paradigm shift that I think that she's almost like a reformer and like wants to improve the current system, versus Bitcoin being this revolutionary and very external and uncontrolled experiment.
Right. There's a heavy sense of paternalism, I think, in Elizabeth Warren's politics, where she wants to protect people from risk. I think you're right that she has good intentions. we also know that the road to hell was paved with good intentions. And I think that's what troubles me about a lot of her policies, right? It's interesting too, because I think her approach to Bitcoin and crypto more broadly mirrors the SEC's approach in wanting to intervene, wanting to make it impossible to create your own currency, for example, without there being huge regulatory barriers to doing that. I think what's missing there is that the SEC, its mission is to protect the American consumer, right? So it's incredibly ironic to me that Gary Gensler's biggest detractors are average Americans, your typical American consumer who's locked out of your typical investing system because of accredited investor laws. I actually think that Bitcoin and the whole cryptocurrency phenomenon generally is a reaction to the fact that the average American can't invest in a way where he can really take risk, right? I think taking risk is a very American ideal at the end of the day. We should have the right to take risks. Of course, you don't ever want to propagate fraud with any of the laws that we have on the books, but I think some politicians, people who are in high office, they need to sit back and realize Americans are grown-ups. You know, they can make their own decisions. And for a huge cross-section of Americans who want to take the risk of investing in Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency, they should have the right to do so under the Constitution. And I think it's that desire to keep everyone safe. It's that culture of safetyism applied to the financial world that I think a lot of Americans they bristle at. They're trying to push back against it. And I think in the end, we will be successful as people who are pro-Bitcoin in just asserting our right to Bitcoin. Obviously, right to Bitcoin is not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but we have a right to hold our own property. And I think that's what Bitcoin is at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I've heard, serious constitutional scholars be like, hey, Bitcoin is free speech. And it is covered by the First Amendment indirectly, within that umbrella, which is pretty broad. But we'll see if the Supreme Court agrees. I don't know at what kind of case it'd probably be a Bank Secrecy Act related case if the executive branch went so far as to say, hey, Bitcoin is a sanctioned entity, right? Like going to kind of the extreme.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a far off risk, but I think it is possible that the executive branch could do something like that. I mean, we know that FDR, back during the era of the Great Depression, he signed an executive order to make holding gold illegal, for example. And I think the more that people see Bitcoin as a threat or a viable alternative to the US dollar, the pro-centralization powers in Washington will push back against that and try to find ways to make it illegal. I think that you see Senator Warren, she's trying to do that already with her anti-money laundering bill that she has in the Senate right now. She's an incredibly charismatic person. I just want to put that out there right now. She and Senator Hatch, they were friends. And I remember one time she came into our office and she had a presence about her, a charisma. I don't know how else to put it. You can see why people like her before they dig deeper into the policies, right? So she's had a way, while she's been in the Senate, of convincing a lot of Republicans to get onto her legislation. I shouldn't say a lot of Republicans, but right now there are two, right? And the way she does it is she signals national security. She says Bitcoin is a threat to national security. Look at this money laundering happening with Bitcoin. She says North Korea is financing their nuclear program with Bitcoin, and that the only way to crack down on this is to make it all but impossible to buy, hold, and trade Bitcoin in the United States. And unfortunately, a lot of legislators, I think, are being duped by this. Again, she's a very charming person. She's a lawyer by trade. She taught at Harvard Law School, if I remember correctly, and she's very persuasive. What they are not seeing is the other side of this argument, the fact that Bitcoin, from an AML perspective, is a terrible idea. If you're a terrorist or a criminal, the last thing you want to do is transact in Bitcoin because everything that happens is on the blockchain for time immemorial. And I think that's what Hamas ran into, right? The Wall Street Journal ran a piece back in October claiming that Hamas had raised over $130 million in cryptocurrency. Patently false at the end of the day. And I can dig into that deeper if we want to, but let's just talk about the Bitcoin side of things for a second. Hamas back in 2019 is when they first started fundraising in Bitcoin. They told their supporters, send us money in Bitcoin. It's A, anonymous, and B, no one's going to know about it. Completely false. In fact, it's pseudonymous. So all law enforcement has to do is attach your wallet ID to a real life identity, which with the tools we have these days is not that hard to do. And again, it's not secret. It's not behind closed doors. It's all there on the blockchain. And it took Hamas a while to figure this out. Actually, the following year, there was a huge bust. It was actually the Department of Justice's biggest crypto bust in history, where they were able to take back a lot of the funds that Hamas had raised via Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, because they saw everything on the blockchain. So actually, in April of this year, Hamas issued a statement to all their supporters saying, please stop sending us Bitcoin. We're worried about your safety. As it turns out, you can be tracked. This isn't anonymous like we thought it was. This is actually a very dangerous way to raise funds illegally. So please stop sending us Bitcoin. Of course, Elizabeth Warren, she won't talk about that in Senate hearings, but those are just the facts right there. And I can go deeper into them if we want, but that's one of the things that drives me crazy is when people say, oh, Bitcoin's only good for money laundering. In fact, it's terrible for money laundering.
Yeah, definitely want to go deeper in the facts here, because I found it. I mean, first of all, I think you're the only one who really brought all the facts together in kind of a coherent story. And every sentence I read, it was like twist after twist. Even now, most recently, I kind of see now it's intersecting with the Binance story, which is that when Hamas was raising funds with crypto, it was going into their Binance account. Is that correct? It wasn't going into their own self-custodied wallet?
So this is how they get away with that $130 million claim. Elliptic, which is a crypto intelligence firm, they published a piece a few months ago that was misread by reporters that, Hamas had raised, I think by Elliptic's numbers, something like $83 million in cryptocurrency. The truth was what that $83 million figure was actually reflecting was the volume flow through crypto wallets that were linked to Hamas. These entities that weren't sending money directly to Hamas, were sending it more likely to legitimate actors, but some of that money was linked to Hamas. And that's where the reporters messed up, is they confused the amount of funds going to Hamas with the volume flow going through entities that were linked to Hamas, if that makes sense. And Binance, if I'm not mistaken, might be one of those. But yeah, people, because Binance is in the headlines too, they're trying to again link, they're trying to tarnish the whole crypto space and the whole Bitcoin space because of this criminal investigation that Binance just went through recently.
And when I was reading about this, I turned to ChatGPT and I was like, what currency do they use in Gaza? And to my shock, it was like mostly the Israeli shekel. I was like, I mean, that kind of makes sense, but it's also quite a bizarre situation. And then we saw a researcher from Israel who is focused on anti-money laundering, who was being questioned by, I believe it was by Elizabeth Warren and others on this topic. And what did she say about that linkage between Hamas and crypto?
Yeah, so that was Dr. Shlomi Wagman, who actually led the campaign in Israel to crack down on illicit finance. And she was answering questions in response to Elizabeth Warren's framing, trying to illustrate that crypto was practically bankrolled the entire Hamas attack. She herself, who again, Dr. Wagman has no stake whatsoever in the cryptocurrency world. She said, I want to emphasize that cryptocurrency is, in her own words, a very small part of the puzzle. The majority of illicit finance happens in the traditional banking world. It happens through fiat, hawalas, your good old typical traditional cash. There is exponentially more money laundering that happens through fiat currency than happens with cryptocurrency. And I know as well that Senator Fetterman, he tried to paint this picture of of crypto being the sole reason why Hamas attacked. And he also got pushback from Dr. Wagman because she had to make clear that actually by making a mountain out of a molehill, which some senators are trying to do with cryptocurrency and illicit financing in the Senate, you're actually detracting from where the true threat lies, which again is in the traditional banking world. It was funny, Senator Fetterman, he actually said, why didn't Hamas use credit cards and bank accounts to finance their terrorism? And the expert witness said, They did.
Yeah.
They did use credit cards. They did use bank accounts. In fact, they did that to a much greater degree than they use cryptocurrency. But again, it's this mind virus on Capitol Hill that people have in their minds that cryptocurrency equals illicit financing, when in fact we know that less than 1% of all illicit financing that takes place worldwide happens with cryptocurrency. So it's putting way too much focus on what is in reality a very, very minor problem compared to the amount of money laundering that takes place in the world of traditional finance.
Well, it's kind of like that Kardashian effect of like, hey, if you mention Bitcoin within the context of some other story, even if it's 0.01% of the story, it's going to be 90% of the coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's sexy and it gets headlines,
Yeah.
you know? And it works. It's a tried and true method. It's just, it's unfortunate because, again, it detracts people's attention away from where the true threat actually lies, which is in traditional banking. You know, I know Binance, they just got dinged pretty badly. I think it was about a $4 billion fine for their connections with money laundering in the past. If you really look at the statistics, though, that $4 billion fine pales in comparison to the bigger banks that have been hit really hard for helping, for example, the cartels in Mexico send illegal drugs to the United States. We know HSBC, for example, got hit with a huge fine not many years ago for their involvement in that. And so, yeah, the Binance fine for their involvement in money laundering pales in comparison to what we've seen in the traditional finance world with traditional banks.
And there's also a really kind of crude element of cynicism, which is that Elizabeth Warren's not a foreign policy hawk. Like, she's getting heat for not being pro Hamas from, you know, her former staffers and a lot of her supporters. To me, it was like, okay, so you have this tragedy happen, this terrorist attack happen, and instead of being focused on, okay, how do we move forward towards peace and reconciliation, it's like, okay, how do I weave Bitcoin into this story and politically profit from it, which is like crass. It's, you know, it's kind of inhumane in a way.
Yeah, I agree. It was Rahm Emanuel who once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And again, to her credit, Elizabeth Warren is a masterful politician. And with the Hamas story, she saw a crisis and a way to resurrect her cryptocurrency narrative, right? Interestingly, before the Hamas attack, her AML bill, her anti-money laundering bill, was actually starting to lag a little bit. The momentum was starting to slow down. But after the attack, she jumped on the opportunity to capitalize on this crisis and get people worked up. And when I say get people worked up, I mean get 104 members of Congress to sign a letter to the White House saying that cryptocurrency and Bitcoin are threats to national security. Again, she just found a way to take the tragedy that happened with Israel, with Hamas's attack, and find a way to link it to cryptocurrency somehow, which I think is pretty cynical at the end of the day. But she doesn't do it only with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and only with national security issues. She actually had a testimony before the Senate Aging Committee the other day where, again, she started talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and scams related to those things as they relate to elderly people. So, I mean, she's nothing if not on message, which, again, effective politicians are. They have their shticks and they stick to them well. And Elizabeth Warren is really good at that. Again, I got to hand it to her on that front, but it gets a little old after a while.
Yeah, and I think that Rahm Emanuel's quote is really, you know, it has to be a crisis that is good in the sense that it lends itself to the policy direction you're going in. And if you immediately hit stumbling blocks of an uncooperative witness, you know, now it's like, well, okay, that attack was blunted, but is your read currently is that it did overall net increase the momentum of the direction she wants to go in?
Unfortunately, yes, I think it did. Because even though her claims and the report that Hamas had raised $130 million in cryptocurrency, which again is patently false, the source that was used to put that number forward refuted it, said, no, you're taking our data and you're misinterpreting it. Those same claims were made in a FinCEN letter recently calling for a crackdown on crypto mixers, for example. So that's what's so frustrating about this situation is once you get the narrative out there, it's really, and other mainstream institutions pick it up, it's really hard to pull that back. And I think that's something we've been trying to do as a Bitcoin community, is try to correct the record. And, I wrote a piece in Forbes essentially fact checking the false narratives that were out there, and it got some pickup, which is good, but it's yet to really sink in and correct the narrative entirely, right? And so unfortunately, there's still some momentum in that space, but there are ways that that momentum can be slowed when they recognize that Elizabeth Warren, she's playing the long game here. We know as early as 2020, she was talking about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and that's actually what she's trying to do with this legislation. Elizabeth Warren's anti-money laundering bill, at the end of the day, it's a bait and switch tactic. What she hopes to do with it is she wants to make it impossible for people to buy, hold, and sell Bitcoin in the United States. Why does she hate Bitcoin? Because it's the antithesis of a central bank digital currency. And that's her long-term goal, is to implement a CBDC over time. But in order to prepare the soil for that, she has to make that soil radioactive for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And that's what she's aiming to do with her AML bill. This bill essentially would make it practically illegal for a teenager mining Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency in his mom's basement. He would have to comply with the same regulatory burdens that a bank like Goldman Sachs has to do. In other words, it would be impossible, right? It would make it illegal to practically touch cryptocurrency or Bitcoin in the United States. But that's by design. Elizabeth Warren intends to do that because if she can get regulations in place that make it impossible to do anything Bitcoin related in the US, she knows she'll drive innovation offshore, and that essentially prepares the way for a CBDC, which is what I believe she's been trying to do this whole time.
Yeah, because I imagine that with her child, the CFPB, she's constantly having to fight the industry, right? The financial services industry, and litigation, and is this constitutional or not? Their funding comes from the Federal Reserve. It's like, okay, that's interesting. And so I think that her goal ultimately is to have a CFPB that is all powerful. In that, with a CBDC, that would mean that you remove the financial services industry as a stakeholder in this, because you're going direct to consumer between the Federal Reserve, which clearly the Federal Reserve is aligned with Elizabeth Warren on some level, given that they're giving money to the CFPB.
Yeah.
And they're, kind of the vehicle for it. But her ultimate strategy is, with good intentions for, the good of the people, that the government would control everyone's money, much like is the case today in communist China. And to me, that's dystopian. But to her, it's a way of probably there's a combination of like the economic management of like just technocratic, neoliberal, this is the most efficient solution, but also the political control of, hey, we can turn off your bank account if we disagree with you or if you disagree with us.
It's horrifying. Yeah, I think every American should be kept up at night at the prospect of a CBDC. And we know to a certain extent they are. Cato, if I'm not mistaken, actually recently issued a poll where they found out that 75% of Americans, so 3 in every 4 Americans, opposes the idea of a CBDC that can track your payments, right? Track your spending, essentially. And so I think what people don't realize is just how hot this political issue is. People get really worked up about a CBDC, and for good reason, because it poses such an enormous threat to our privacy, right? You mentioned China's digital yuan. So China, they've already released their own CBDC, and it's like an episode out of Black Mirror, right? They can turn your money on and off at a moment's notice. And people would say, oh, here in the US, that wouldn't happen. No, it could absolutely happen. We've seen banks, for example, close down the accounts of people that they banked to. They thought their political opinions were undesirable. I mean, we know that this happens in the private sector right now. And if you give the state this power, it could happen even more easily. The government could turn on or turn off your money on a whim. Essentially, they could micro-target stimulus to, send you some CBDC dollars and say, here's $500, but you can only spend it on the retail sector because that's the sector of the economy that's flagging right now. It essentially gives the government control over our own purse strings. And I think that's a horrifying prospect. And Republicans and Democrats alike should be very concerned about that possibility, because you have people both in Congress and in the administration who are flirting with this idea. And I think once politicians wake up to just how dangerous the idea is and start campaigning on that, they'll do it to great effect.
Yeah, because it's kind of a situation where even if you want a CBDC in order to accomplish your policy goals, you have to keep in mind that your next term might be your political opponent who is going to turn that around on you. And, they're going to cut off your bank account because they disagree with you. But the other part of it is the monetary policy side of capital controls, right? So that essentially they can put a fence around people's savings so that you can't escape their dilution through money printing.
It's terrifying stuff. Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. It's capital controls, but on a micro level, like we've never seen before, In China, there are capital controls where they keep their people from moving money outside the country. But what you're describing essentially is people wouldn't be able to move their savings to other banking accounts or spend it in certain ways. Yeah, it's a nightmare scenario, I think, especially for someone who is pro-Bitcoin. And that's something I want to emphasize, is that Bitcoin stands in opposition to all of this. Bitcoin is the anti-CBDC. And you're seeing right now in American politics, there's some politicians who are picking up on this fact. There's a theory in business called the blue ocean strategy, which when you apply this strategy to politics has interesting implications. So just to describe what the blue ocean strategy is, if you're starting a business, you can either compete in a red ocean, which is to say a contested market, a place where you're really going to have to fight tooth and nail to get your business going and to keep it alive. So for example, if I wanted to start a hamburger restaurant today, I would be entering a red ocean, a very contested market. I'd be competing against McDonald's, Burger King, Five Guys, In-N-Out. I would be eaten alive. Hence, there would be blood in the water. It'd be a red ocean, right? In contrast to that, there's a blue ocean strategy, which is where you start a business and offer a service in an uncontested market. So how does this apply to Bitcoin? Well, essentially, Bitcoiners and crypto holders more broadly, they represent a blue ocean in terms of politics. There's really no one in the past few years who has actively courted the Bitcoin vote, for example. But you're starting to see these political entrepreneurs come on the scene, people like RFK Jr., Vivek, Ron DeSantis. And what they're doing is they recognize, whoa, these Bitcoin holders and cryptocurrency holders more broadly, this is an extremely passionate community. What can we do to court their vote? And it's almost in response to the fact that the Biden administration and some other members of Congress have started to attack these people who actually have tried to stay away from politics because they're libertarian by nature. They don't have a great faith in government, so a lot of them probably haven't voted. But this is kind of the beauty of Bitcoin as a political tool, and I think it will play a key role in the 2024 election. If you have a presidential candidate who recognizes that Bitcoin is a blue ocean and he goes and starts a business, so to speak, let's say in this situation, he offers to give them representation before the US government, those are millions, and I'm not even exaggerating, millions of votes that person could pick up. Just a couple numbers on that. Recently, Morning Consult did some polling in 4 key swing states that show that 3.4 million people in those swing states hold cryptocurrency, and 55% of those people say that Bitcoin values, these values of decentralization, are a make or break issue for them at the ballot box. So in other words, that comes out to about 1.9 million voters in those 4 swing states alone who say that Bitcoin and whether a candidate supports it or opposes it is essentially a make or break issue for them. So that's 1.9 million voters that are there for the presidential candidate's taking. And it's, again, a blue ocean strategy where that's why you have Ron DeSantis, Vivek, both these guys have come out with their own crypto strategies, their own crypto agendas, because what they're doing is they are setting up shop in that blue ocean. They're courting those voters who, keep in mind, are both Republican and Democrat. There's actually more Democratic holders of cryptocurrency than there are Republican voters. And so they're essentially have this opportunity to poach these swing state voters and potentially build a coalition around them just for the sheer fact that they support Bitcoin and the values of decentralization.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say they're a single issue voter, and it's all about Bitcoin, regardless of the other positions that a candidate might have. And I think that comes from this meme of like, fix the money, fix the world. Is that, hey, even if you disagree with a political candidate on other parts of their platform, Bitcoin is so pivotal and so it's going to change so many other parts of politics that it actually doesn't really matter that you disagree with them on other side issues. That as long as they're pro Bitcoin, that you're gonna be supportive of that.
Yeah, it sends a signal. I mean, if you are pro Bitcoin, it says so much more about you. It's a good heuristic for being able to understand what that person's values are. It's extremely likely that they value individual liberty, and the idea of sovereignty as well, personal sovereignty. I mean, it sends a lot of signal, just the fact that someone holds Bitcoin. It tells you a lot about that person, I think.
Yeah, and that they are not there to exploit, essentially, right? And I think that, yeah, it says that they're honest. Now, that can be exaggerated because there's plenty of criminals that also hold Bitcoin. Well, not in relation to that, separately. The U.S. government holds 100,000 Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting. They're supposed to. I heard that they are supposed to have auctioned that off already, and they seem to be kind of holding on to it a little longer than they should be.
Yeah, it's my personal theory that the U.S. government should hodl their Bitcoin for time and all eternity.
Well, and if you think of from a geostrategic perspective of, hey, there's a certain probability that Bitcoin will replace the U.S. dollar. You don't have to think it's 100%. You could just think it's 5%. You rationally would hedge and say, all right, let's hold a little bit of Bitcoin.
Exactly.
As the U.S. government, because if this probability plays out, then we'll be okay.
Right. I think it's that simple at the end of the day. Like you said, if this is going to be the next gold, a digital gold, then it makes all the sense in the world to hold an asset that will likely go at least 10x from here. And so just from a geostrategic perspective, it makes all the sense in the world to hold on to that Bitcoin, especially as you see more nation states starting to mine Bitcoin themselves.
Yeah.
Bhutan being an interesting example. I know in the Middle East, there are states looking at mining their own Bitcoin. I actually think that will be the narrative that drives the next cycle. This cycle, you will see the institutions come. I mean, they're already coming via BlackRock, Fidelity, and I think you'll see that trend continue more and more. But I think what drives the next cycle is this recognition that, okay, this is hard money. This is the scarcest asset. It's the scarcest resource on planet Earth. What can we do to get a piece of this pie? And I think you will see more nation state mining of Bitcoin at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree. All right. On that very bullish note, thanks for coming, Sam. Let's do this again soon. And thanks, Gabe. I know I didn't leave any time for questions from you, but I hope that you found it interesting.
No, you guys did amazing. I really appreciate, Sam, you coming on here today and giving us a new perspective on all things that are in your world. So, yeah, Pierre.
All right. Join us next week. And don't forget to share the podcast, subscribe, both to the YouTube and in your favorite podcast app. Leave us a 5-star review. And looking forward to the next episode. Cheers.